In the first reading, we hear what God did to make this covenant with Abraham. And this is the covenant that leads to the Exodus, the Exodus of Moses from Egypt. When that day comes, it's that God's people, to whom he has promised faithfulness and care to make of them a great nation, the sons and daughters of Abraham, they become enslaved. The Egyptians have enslaved them, oppressed them, put them to forced labor, and then they cry out to the Lord. So this is what we were hearing last weekend, I think, when we heard what you're supposed to say when you bring sacrifice to the Lord. My father was a wandering Aramaean, and then we were oppressed in Egypt, but the Lord worked mighty deeds to bring us out. So it's this covenant that we heard the beginning of in the first reading that leads to the Exodus. And again, the Exodus is God's liberation of his people from slavery in Egypt. In the gospel, and the reason why these are paired up for us today, in the gospel, Jesus is transfigured, and there's a lot going on. There's a lot of flashing and lights. His face has changed in appearance, and his clothes become dazzling white, and Moses and Elijah are there. And it's easy to pass over this, actually. It says, what were Moses and Elijah doing there with him? They were speaking with him about his exodus that he was going to accomplish in Jerusalem. Okay, so this is Jesus, the new Moses, who's going to bring his people liberation from the oppressor. And in this case, this exodus is the liberation of God's people from this greater enslavement than to Pharaoh and the Egyptians, the enslavement to sin and death. Okay, so this is Jesus' exodus that he's going to accomplish with a new Passover. Just like we have the Passover in the book of Exodus with the Paschal Lamb. And then finally an exodus in his death and resurrection that is like liberation and freedom from sin. But here's the difficult part. After years in slavery in Egypt, God's people, after they're liberated, they did not know how to be free. It comes out in three ways. When they have crossed the Red Sea and seen like God reveal himself in a pillar of fire and in a pillar of cloud and done mighty deeds and the plagues on the Egyptians and the Passover, finally to split the Red Sea so that they can pass through, and then for it to destroy their enemies, the Egyptians. Like very shortly after this, they commit idolatry and they build a golden calf and worship that in place of the God that has set them free. They can't tolerate or endure the mystery of the nearness of God, and so they build something that they can see and touch and worship that. Okay, because they don't know how. They don't know how to be faithful to God. Then, once they have crossed the desert for the first time, they went straight to the promised land, okay, and they get there, and God says, okay, you can go in. It will take courage because there's people living here, but I will give this land to you. Like you have to fight them, but I will be with you. And they shrink back, and they don't have the courage to do it. The reports come back, and they say, the people here are giants, and we're like insects before them. We can't go in there. Okay, they're too terrified because they're still living in slavery in their own hearts. Because of this, God says, okay, well, let's go back. We're going to spend 40 years wandering in the desert. And while they're in the desert, then, this is so funny, where there's no food and no nourishment and all that stuff, God provides for them miraculously over and over. He gives them water from a rock, and he gives them manna, bread, miraculously every day, as much as they need. Every day, this bread comes from the earth. He gives them meat, too. He gives them quail from heaven. And they say, we're sick of this wretched food, this miraculous food. We're sick of this wretched food. And they complain about what's provided, and they say, and this is just kind of, it's so daring. It's so far. They say, we want to go back to Egypt because we had our vegetables, we had our homes, we had our flesh pots. We want to go back to Egypt. And Moses has to remind them, you were slaves in Egypt. It wasn't what you remember it. Do you remember being oppressed? Do you remember what God has set you free from? We're not going back to Egypt. That is a place of slavery. Okay, but they complain. The reason why God gives them these 40 years in the desert is because though they have been liberated, they've been set free, they don't know how to live as free people. And they still think and act and speak as slaves. So these 40 years in the desert are so that God can teach them how to live as free people. For us in baptism, this is when we entered into Jesus' exodus, crossed the Red Sea. You know, this is why baptism and the Red Sea are so closely connected. On one side of the water is slavery, and we pass through water, and on the other side is liberation and freedom, and we are no longer slaves of sin. In baptism, we crossed the Red Sea, we died and rose with Jesus, and so we're freed from the slavery to sin. But now, we do not know how to live as free people, as people who are freed from slavery to sin and death. You don't have to look very far to realize this. I mean, we also have a difficult time with the mystery of God, and so we take on idols. To see some of the difficulty, you just look in the first reading in the gospel. Like when God comes close to Abraham, he's enveloped in a deep, terrifying darkness, and this is where the covenant is made. When Jesus is transfigured in the gospel, it says a cloud came and cast a shadow on them, and they became frightened when they entered the cloud, that is revealing God's presence. Also, when Moses is giving the law, God reveals himself to the people, and they say, after hearing his voice and him revealing himself to them, they say, we don't want him to speak to us anymore. It's too much. Just have him speak to you, Moses, and then you bring the word to us. Okay, so we have trouble with the mystery of God also. The second thing, just like them, we lack courage. When God says, this is the gift that I have for you, this is the promised land that I have for you, you just have to go in and take it, but it's going to take some courage and trust. We falter, we get scared, and we say, I don't think I can do that. And God says, I will be with you. And we say, I'd rather not cross this threshold and go in. And we complain too. And sometimes we want to return. I mean, you know how these complaints are. Do you ever get sick of being good? You ever wonder, like, man, if I didn't know God, then I would do whatever I wanted and not be bothered by my conscience about it. Sometimes you look around, you know, it's been kind of a wild weekend around here because St. Patrick's Day is tomorrow, and it's a weekend, so people start celebrating early. Like, do you ever look at, you know, people just kind of lose themselves in what is not good, and think, I wonder what it would be like if I could do that. Or maybe you came from that and you think, sometimes we long for that. Here's the deal, we got to go gently about this, because I always like, I looked down on the Israelites for how many times they're unfaithful to God, how quickly they commit adultery, how they can say these outlandish things where they say we want to go back to Egypt. But to be honest, my heart, probably every day, longs for Egypt. I'm drawn to sin, just like all of you. We can be pretty harsh with ourselves about that. Like, how can you ever want that? How would you ever want to go back to that land of slavery, you know? Like, do you not know what the gift is that's given to you? But actually, we can take this approach instead. We want to be gentler and simply look at our hearts and see and acknowledge you do not yet know how to live in freedom. And all you have known, what's automatic and easy, is to live as a slave. But you are not a slave anymore. So we are learning how to be free. It can be a real challenge, actually, because it's right in front of us. And this is like, I don't know, it's like the glory and the difficulty of being human, that we seem to always get it wrong. We seem to always be poorly prepared for what is in front of us. I can really relate to the gospel today, because I mean, what's happening here? Jesus is being transfigured. There's glory. Moses and Elijah are speaking to Jesus. And the apostles, Peter, James, and John, it says they were overcome by sleep. And then they wake up. And it says it really kindly. It says, becoming fully awake, they saw his glory. Usually on Sunday, I wake up at 6. And This morning, I woke up at 8:27. And I can tell you what is meant by becoming fully awake means like just leaping straight up out of bed and right into your socks and shoes, you know? Like, do I have time to brush my teeth? But this is how it always is with us, you know, because we haven't learned how to live as free people yet. And because of the weakness of our hearts, like the glory is in front of us. We are living in freedom now, and we don't see it, and we get overcome by sleep. At least I was this morning. And then we open our eyes and we're like not prepared for it. And then seeing the glory of God, St. Peter says, let us make 3 tents, and it says right in there, but he did not know what he was saying. Like the gift of freedom, the gift of glory, what is given to us in baptism, what God provides for us in his pilgrim church, like we have no idea. And we almost never recognize it. And when we do, we're like late and then we have bedhead, you know? This is why, one reason why we have Lent. God gave his people 40 years in the desert to train them, to teach them a new way of thinking and acting and feeling, to teach them how to live in freedom, with courage, with trust in God, never looking back to that place of slavery. God gives us these 40 days of Lent as like a little step in, a little taste of these 40 years in the desert to teach us, his people, how to be free, how to go and be ready for our arrival in the promised land.